Hello and welcome back to the devlog. In this episode we will go over such things as the save system, the dialogue system, and even my best friend, the cutscene system, and much more. But before we start getting into the intense stuff, I'll catch you up on some small progress I've done since the last episode. First off, I joined a game jam, more specifically the GitHub Game Off. If you remember, in the last episode I mentioned wanting to learn Godot, and the opportunity finally came. Sadly, my team of 2 friends were too busy to help me, so I recruited some absolute gigachads from the Pirate Software Discord server. Sadly, I may have exported the Godot project wrong, so the executable I submitted doesn't actually work. Oops! You may have noticed, but thus far, I've only used songs that are part of our original soundtrack. And our musician wasn't the only one who was busy. Our artist also made some environment decor and some sprites of the player. Now let's go over the things I've done. I think the best place to start is where everything in Unity starts, game objects. In the words of every single beginner tutorial ever, everything in Unity is a game object. This square is a game object. This oddly diamond ore looking environment is a game object. Do you know who else is a game object? This guy. You're him now. You might notice that he looks pretty similar to that one guy from that one game, and you're right. And this will be a reoccurring theme, because this game is just a mishmash of media I like. For example, the world is basically just a combination of the Pokemon games and Jujutsu Kaisen. Okay, just hear me out on this one. For that one guy who doesn't know any of them, in Pokemon, the world consists of the titular monsters, who can be caught by trainers, who are basically just lone travelers. The whole reason for spending all your days as a hermit, with your only company being glorified furry bait, is that if you meet another trainer, you can force your Pokemon to fight illegal Chinese rooster battle style. Simple concept, right? I'm sure they couldn't stretch it out for over 120 games. Now, Jujutsu Kaisen is vastly different. It's basically your run-of-the-mill shonen battle anime. What if there are monsters, but only few people can see monsters? And what if these guys have magical abilities and the story is just these guys and monsters beating the shit out of each other? Peak writing, over 200 manga chapters. Now, you may struggle to see how these two fit together, but let me explain. Imagine that instead of begging cartoon animals to be your friends, just to make them fight other cartoon animals like an absolute beta male, how about you could just Kyoshiki Murasaki. What I'm trying to say is that my world works on a really simple mechanic. There are mages who, like the Pokemon trainers, just wander around looking for monsters. But here's the difference. Once they find them, they use less power of friendship and more Kyoshiki Murasaki. Basically, they are just freelance ghostbusters. And one of them is... Ah yes, the full circle. I love it. Now, let's jump into our little checklist. Okay, this is really simple. We just slap a rigid body on our player and make a little script where we set its velocity based on what buttons the player is pressing. For animation, we just switch between the frames based on the player's velocity. Now, before we get into the inventory, I have to clarify that I've made the inventory and the player way before everything else, like as the first non-practice game dev thing I ever made. So you could guess this code is absolutely horrid. The player is fine because I just worked along with one of the billion Unity movement tutorials. But this code I just pulled out entirely out of my own very inexperienced ass. And the funny thing is, I made a completely different, actually half-competent item system for the battles, but I haven't changed the overworld system yet. So there is the actually acceptable implementation of the inventory, which I did with fancy hackerman magic like inheritance and overriding, like the proper way you're supposed to do it. But at the end of the battles, it translates to the terrible inventory, which is literally just storing the items as plain text in the player script, then using a gigantic if statement once the player uses an item. Okay, so the next one is the dialogue system, and I'm actually pretty excited to talk about this one. It's basically an extension of Pandemonium's Undertale-style dialogue system. To disgustingly oversimplify his video, every single line of the dialogue is stored as a separate game object. The more performance-oriented way of doing this would be just storing all the lines as plain text, but this approach offers much more customizability for a little bit worse performance, which I'm actually willing to sacrifice, since the game's system requirements are really low, even like this. After adding the basic system, I made the NPCs have multiple dialogue options based on a set of conditions that can be specified by an additional script. I also added a response option. I at least remade the UI part of the inventory, which is just basically a big text box with a lot of response options. Basically, there's just an invisible NPC inside of the player at all times, who asks you which items you want to use, and uses the before mentioned condition checking to respond. It's just so reusable for UI, I simply love it. The cutscene system is quite interesting, since I believe this is the first actually functional part of the game that I made without basing it on an already existing tutorial or game system. Every cutscene is just a list of lines of text, which is just an extremely scuffed programming language if you think about it. Let's take this command for an example. The first part of this command is the instruction itself, which just moves a character to a specific location. The individual settings are separated by these horizontal lines. The first one specifies which character to move, the next three are the coordinates to move to, and the last one is the time it takes to move to the coordinates. The other commands include, but aren't limited to, animation, playing sounds, and even completely switching scenes. Speaking of which, so the scene switching and saving are kinda unique. They are in a kind of symbiotic relationship with the game. Let me explain. So when it came time to have multiple rooms, I made the basics of the saving mechanic. Every different room is a different file, aka scene. So I made doors that switch between them if you touch them. But here comes the problem. They exist without any knowledge of each other, so the player always spawns in the middle of the room. To solve this, I use my best friend, the scriptable object, which is just a container in Unity to keep some information in memory independently of the scene. Now every time you enter through a door, that door tells the scriptable object where the other side of that door is, and it all works now. But wait, there is the bane of my existence, the inventory. Stepping through doors just steals all your items, because the room you just stepped into exists in an alternate file. So, back to the drawing board we go. The best solution to this, in my opinion, is, when you touch a door, you pass all your items to a scriptable object, then check where the position of the other side of the door is, then step through to that location, and finally take your items back. But oh, now quitting the game makes you lose all your progress, so I made save points where you can sleep. Where you sleep, all your possessions get copied into a JSON file, just like real life. But there's this little unknown game called Undertale, and it's like my third biggest inspiration, and it's just coincidentally famous for having several endings you can achieve. So here I go, storing every single detail in a scriptable object, and those in the save file. The saving system will be developed throughout the entirety of the development time, because every new feature needs to be added to it. And that's supposed to be it, but I'm terrible at making videos, so there are a lot of things that I just could not fit in the script in a way that they make sense. So I will be attempting to speedrun over these things over Kirby music. Camera. It normally follows the player, but you can hit these zones that change it so the camera only follows on the y-axis or the x-axis or no axis. Shops. Currently, they are just text boxes. They will have to be completely remade with the separate art style I have in mind for battles and shops. Speaking of which, I want this art style to be similar to the stat menu in Isaac. Basically, a digitally scanned white background of a paper, and on top of that, a black pixel art with cutscenes being this sick-ass flipnote animation style. Whew, that certainly was a long one. And it took a while to edit too. I do not plan on having more of these really long episodes, but we will see. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this, please subscribe and share. It helps small channels like me to grow. Goodbye!